Welcome, dear listener, to this calm journey through history's annals. As you settle in to enjoy restful sleep or a moment of quiet reflection, I invite you to transport your mind to a time and place far away. Imagine, if you will, a kingdom of stone castles, great tapestries, and royal pomp, medieval Europe. Before we embark on our exploration of the lives of the royal women of this era, I would love to know from what part of the world you're joining us today. Whether it's morning, noon, or night in your corner of the globe, I am very happy that you have decided to spend this time with me. If you like this type of calm historical narratives, I encourage you to subscribe so that we can embark together on many more adventures through the centuries. Now let's gently go back in time to an era that is often idealized in tales of chivalry and courtly love. But for the women of royal blood who lived in those times, life was far from being a fairy tale. Theirs was a world of great uncertainty, where political alliances could change on a whim, and the mass and the throne of dynasties rested on their shoulders. Imagine yourself in a damp, drafty stone chamber. The flickering candlelight casts dancing shadows on the wall. This is the room of a medieval queen, a woman who, despite her high title, often faced a dangerous, precarious existence. The great tapestries and rich velvet curtains may create an illusion of warmth and comfort, but the reality, even for the women of the highest birth of the era, used to be one of hardship and danger. In the pages of history books, we can glimpse queens adorned with jewels and crowned with gold whose names are engraved next to those of kings. But the true stories of these women, their fears, their struggles, and their triumphs, are often lost in the course of time. Tonight, we will strive to revive those stories, illuminate the shadows of the past, and pay tribute to the resilience and strength of the women who lived them. As we travel back to the Middle Ages, let us keep in mind that the life of royal women was a constant balance between duty and survival. From the moment of their birth, princesses were considered valuable political assets. Their marriages were arranged to forge alliances and secure peace between kingdoms. They were expected to be pious, virtuous, and, above all, provide heirs to secure the royal line. But in a world where the whims of men could determine the fate of nations, even the most exalted women lived under the constant threat of danger. Murder, revolt, and war were omnipresent specters, lurking in the shadows of even the grandest castles. And in an era when medical knowledge was at best rudimentary, merely fulfilling their most essential duty, giving birth, could mean a death sentence. However, even in the face of adversity, many royal women managed to carve out spheres of influence and leave their mark. Some ruled as regents for their husbands, skillfully navigating the treacherous waters of medieval politics. Others became patrons of the arts, using their wealth and status to foster cultural growth. And a few, thanks to their willpower and personality, managed to defy the conventions of their era and seize power in their own right. As we delve into the stories of these extraordinary women, I invite you to let your imagination transport you into their world. Imagine walking through the stone corridors of a medieval castle, with the hem of your dress dragging through the rushes scattered on the floor. Imagine the weight of a jeweled crown on your forehead and whispered intrigues of the courtiers echoing in your ears. In the coming hours, we will meet queens and princesses, duchesses and countesses, women who faced unimaginable challenges and yet left an indelible mark on the pages of history. So make yourselves comfortable, dear listeners, and let the stories of these heroines of the past paint pictures in your mind as you immerse yourselves in a peaceful dream. Our first stop on this journey will be the turbulent life of Matilda, daughter of King Henry I of England. Born 1102, Matilda was destined from birth to be a pawn in the great game of politics. As the only legitimate daughter of Henry I, she was his heir apparent, a status that led her to a life of struggle and conflict. Matilda's early years were marked by the turmoil that was so common for royal women of her era. When she was only 8 years old, she was sent to Germany to marry Henry V, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. This was a political alliance, pure and simple, a way for her father to secure a powerful ally. For the young Matilda, It meant moving away from everything that was familiar to her and being thrown into a foreign court where she knew neither the language nor the customs. We can only imagine the fear and loneliness she must have felt as she crossed the sea to her new home. Her destiny was sealed by the maneuvers of men she barely knew. As Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, Matilda was expected to play the role of wife and queen. She was known for her piety and patronage of religious houses, virtues valued in a medieval consort. But Matilda's life was not going to be quiet or full of domestic satisfactions. In 1125, Emperor Henry V died suddenly, leaving Matilda a widow at only 23 years old. Thus, she found herself again at the center of a political maelstrom. With no male heirs to inherit the Holy Roman Empire, Matilda was forced to fight for her rights as ruler in her own right. She returned to England, where her father named her as his heir presumptive, a virtually unprecedented measure in an era when the idea of a woman ruling in her own right was almost unthinkable. But Matilda's right to the throne was far from assured. When Henry I died in 1135, the stage was set for a confrontation between Matilda and her cousin Stephen of Blois, who had seized the throne during her absence. What followed was a period of chaos and civil war known as the Anarchy, in which Matilda and Stephen fought for dominance. For almost 2 decades, England was torn apart by the conflict, while the two claimants to the throne and their supporters clashed in bloody battles and sieges. Throughout it all, Matilda demonstrated remarkable tenacity and willpower for a woman of that time. She herself led armies into battle, endured atrocious sieges, and narrowly escaped capture on more than one occasion. In 1141, she came close to securing the throne, even holding court in London as the Lady of England. But the tide of war and male prejudices were ultimately too much for her. In the end, it was Matilda's son, Henry II, who went on to rule England, founding the Plantagenet dynasty. But Matilda's legacy endured not only in her offspring, but in the very idea that a woman could aspire to rule in her own right. Her story is a testament to the indomitable spirit of medieval royal women, who often faced unimaginable adversities and still found strength to persevere. In an era when women were considered little more than property to be traded, Matilda dared to fight for her place in history. As we continue our journey through the lives of medieval queens and princesses, we will encounter many more stories of courage and resilience in the face of adversity. From Eleanor of Aquitaine to Isabella of France, these women navigated the treacherous waters of medieval politics with determination and skill. But for now, dear listener, let us pause and reflect on the life of Matilda, a woman who defied the conventions of her time, leaving an indelible mark on the pages of history. As you fall asleep, imagine her riding at the head of her army, her banner waving in the wind, her gaze fixed on the horizon and the crown that was rightfully hers. In our next chapter, we will explore the fate of royal women who were sent far from home as political pawns in the great game of medieval diplomacy. Imagine being a young princess, barely a teenager, sent to a foreign land to marry a man you've never seen, all for a political alliance. This was the fate of countless royal women in the Middle Ages, who often found themselves at the mercy of men who ruled their lives. From Eleanor of Aquitaine to Margaret of Provence, we will meet queens who endured loveless marriages, dangerous intrigues, and constant threat of exile. But for now, let the story of Matilda's courage and determination be the last image in our minds before we immerse ourselves in restful sleep. Her story reminds us that, even in the darkest times, the human spirit has an incredible capacity for resilience and strength. Good night, dear listener, and sweet dreams. When we meet again, we will continue to explore the lives of medieval royal women, lives marked by duty, danger, and the eternal struggle for power and survival in a world dominated by men. As we have seen, medieval queens and princesses face the ever-present specter of childbirth, a dangerous and often deadly trial in an era before modern medicine. One of these tragic stories is that of Neville, wife of King Richard III and Queen of England for just over a year. born into the influential Neville family, and was no stranger to the twists of fortune that characterized the lives of medieval noblewomen. Her father, known as Warwick the Kingmaker, was instrumental in dethroning King Henry V and placing Edward IV on the throne. But when Warwick turned against Edward and found herself embroiled in a bloody civil conflict, married at age 14 to Edward, Prince of Wales, in a political alliance, and became Princess of Wales. But her young husband died in combat a few months later. Widowed and taken prisoner, Anne's future was plunged into uncertainty. In a twist of fate, she would soon marry Richard, Duke of Gloucester, rival of her late husband and future Richard III. When Richard ascended the throne in 1483 and was crowned queen consort in a lavish ceremony, but her reign would be brief. Just a year later, Anne suffered the devastating loss of her only son, Edward of Middleham, aged 10. The death of the prince left Richard without an heir and, by all accounts, and was devastated by the loss. To compound this tragedy, Anne's health soon deteriorated. In March 1485, the 28-year-old queen died, possibly of tuberculosis or, according to some rumors, of a broken heart. Her life and tragic end exemplify the precarious position of even the noblest women in the Middle Ages, who were always at the mercy of political intrigues and cruel fate's whims. Consumed by grief and illness, and Neville was buried in Westminster Abbey, the same sacred place where she had been crowned recently. The grandeur of her funeral only underscored the fleeting nature of her glory. In just a few months, her husband would also die, killed in combat by Henry VII. And so, the wheel of fortune turned again, giving way to a new dynasty and relegating into the shadows of history. But, although in Neville's life was tragically cut short, other medieval queens managed to forge a lasting legacy through their piety. In an era when the role of women was strictly defined, acts of religious devotion and patronage provided an acceptable outlet for their wealth. One such patron was Philippa of Hainaut, Queen of England, wife of King Edward III. Philippa is often overshadowed by her formidable mother-in-law, Isabella of France, whom we will discuss later. But, with her usual discretion, Philippa left a mark on the cultural landscape of 14th century England. Born in the bosom of the Francophone nobility of Hull, today part of Belgium, Philippa married Eduardo in a diplomatic alliance at the tender age of 13. Arriving in a foreign country and navigating the complex network of English court politics must not have been easy for the young princess. But, according to all accounts, Philippa rose to the challenge with elegance and strength. As queen, Philippa became known for her piety and generosity. She regularly supported religious houses, to which she donated jewels and rich gifts. But perhaps her most enduring legacy was her patronage of Queen's College, Oxford. Founded in 1341 at the behest of Felipe, Queen's College was innovative in its mission to educate students from its native Hor. At a time when university education was largely the privilege of the English elite, this was a revolutionary measure. Felipe's influence also marked the style of the school. The magnificent chapel of Queen's College, with its towering windows and vaulted ceiling, was built under her patronage. Philippa's patronage extended beyond the religious sphere into literature. She was an important defender of Jean Froissart, one of the most prominent chroniclers of the 14th century. Under her patronage, Froissart began his famous chronicles, a vivid, though not always impartial, account of the 100 Years' War between England and France. Philippa's story reminds us that, although medieval queens were often relegated to the margins of power, they could exert significant influence through cultural and religious patronage. In a world where women's voices were often silenced, art, architecture, and pious works allowed them to leave their mark on history. But, despite the comfort that religion and patronage could provide, the truth is that the life of a medieval queen was, ultimately, subject to the whims of men. And when the political winds changed, even the most influential women could find themselves cast out into the cold. Such was the fate of Margarita of Provence, Queen of France, wife of Louis V. Margarita's story takes us from the heights of influence to the depths of despair, painting a vivid portrait of the precarious position of a medieval queen. Born into the Provençal nobility, Margarita was famous for her beauty and intelligence. Married to Louis at only 13 years old, she initially enjoyed a position of great influence in the French court. The young king was evidently in love with his wife, and Margarita used her influence to promote the interests of her relatives and allies. But Margarita's power soon caught the attention of the French nobility, who resented the influence of these foreign intruders. Rumors began to circulate about Margarita's alleged infidelity, casting doubt on the paternity of her children. Although these rumors were probably unfounded, they highlighted the precariousness of a queen's reputation in the royal court. Margarita's luck took a turn when Louis embarked on the Seventh Crusade in 1248. With the king absent in the Holy War, the nobility seized the opportunity to act against Margarita and her faction. The queen mother, Blanca de Castilla, used her considerable influence to marginalize Margarita and reaffirm her control over the regency government. Stripped of her power and position, Margarita made the desperate decision to join her husband on crusade. It was a dangerous journey for a woman, fraught with the dangers of sea travel and the machinations of hostile forces. But for Margarita, it seemed the only way to escape the indignities that were being inflicted on her in France. However, in a cruel twist of fate, Margarita would find little respite in the Holy Land. Louis had been captured by Egyptian forces, and Margarita arrived to find herself effectively a prisoner in a foreign land. According to contemporary accounts, she gave birth to her son in distressing circumstances, surrounded by the constant threat of violence. Margarita's ordeal exemplifies the razor's edge on which the fate of a medieval queen balanced. From the heights of power to the depths of despair, her story oscillated between the whims of men and the quicksand of political fortune. Hers was a life lived in the shadow of power, always contingent and always precarious. Eventually, Margarita and Louis would return to France after the disastrous end of the crusade. The king was a changed man. His fervor for holy war had been tempered by the brutal reality of the battlefield. As for Margarita, she increasingly took refuge in piety and charitable works, perhaps seeking solace in the certainties of faith. When Louis departed on another ill-fated crusade in 1270, Margarita was left behind to act as regent with her son. It was a moving into a life marked by so many twists and turns of fate. Margarita outlived her husband by almost 3 decades, witnessing the reigns of her son and grandson. In the end, the story of Margarita of Provence summarizes many of the themes we have explored in the lives of medieval queens. From the heights of power to the depths of despair, hers was a life buffeted by political fortune. However, despite everything, she was a testament to the resilience and strength of the women who so often bore the weight of medieval politics. But of course, not all medieval queens were content to remain in the shadows. Some, thanks to their willpower and personality, managed to carve out a sphere of real influence and power. One of the most notorious examples is Isabel of France, the so-called she-wolf, who dethroned her husband, King Edward II of England. Isabel's story seems taken from a dark fairy tale, a story of love, betrayal, and ultimately revenge. Born into the bosom of the French royal family, Isabel was married to Edward II at the tender age of 12 as part of a diplomatic alliance. But from the start, the marriage was plagued by tensions and distrust. By all accounts, Edward was a weak and ineffective king, more interested in his male favorites than affairs of government. The foremost of these favorites was Piers Gaveston, a charismatic Gascon gentleman who exerted an almost hypnotic power over the young king. Edward's obsession with Gaveston and his willingness to shower him with titles and riches soon caught the attention of the English nobility. For Isabel, Gaveston's influence over her husband must have been a constant source of frustration and humiliation. She was practically marginalized in her own marriage, and her status as queen was overshadowed by a gentleman of low birth. But Isabel was not a timid woman. She waited for her moment, forging alliances and cultivating her power base. The turning point came in 1325, when Edward sent Isabel on a diplomatic mission to France. It was a decision he would come to regret. In France, Isabel found a powerful ally in Roger Mortimer, a disgruntled English noble exiled by Edward. Together, they plotted a plan to dethrone the king and install Isabel's son, the future Edward III, on the throne. What followed was a surprising coup that would change the course of English history. With Mortimer at her side and an army behind her, Isabel landed on the English coast in 1326. The pair quickly gained the support of disgruntled nobles and marched on London, gaining momentum as they advanced. Faced with this overwhelming show of force, Edward II had no choice but to flee. He was eventually captured and imprisoned. His fate was sealed by the same nobles who had once supported him. In a chilling act of revenge, Isabel ordered her husband to be brutally murdered, a fact that earned her the nickname She-Wolf in the annals of history. For a time, Isabel and Mortimer ruled England as co-regents, without any higher authority controlling their power. It was a remarkable reversal of the traditional gender roles of medieval society. A woman exercising power with a man as consort and executor. But, as with all stories of power and ambition, Isabel's story did not have a happy ending. Her son Edward III rebelled against Mortimer's influence and eventually staged a coup, having his mother's lover arrested and executed. Isabel was spared, but spent the rest of her life in luxurious exile, stripped of her power and influence. In the end, Isabel of France's story is a testament to how far a medieval queen would go to assert her own will in a world dominated by men. With the strength of her will and her personality, she upset the established order and seized power in a way that few women of her time could have dreamed of. But her story also serves as a warning, a reminder of the dangers that lurked even for the most formidable women in the ruthless world of medieval politics. After all, Isabel's power was always fragile, dependent on the whims of the men around her. When those whims changed, as was inevitable, she was cast aside, a victim of the same forces she had once tried to control. As we reach the end of our journey through the lives of these extraordinary women, it is worth reflecting on the harsh realities they faced. Being a queen in the Middle Ages was like walking a tightrope, in a precarious balance between power and danger. On one hand, these women enjoyed a level of privilege and influence unimaginable for most of their contemporaries. They had access to the wealth, education, and cultural resources that set them apart from the vast majority of medieval society. Some, like Philippa of Hainaut, used this privilege to leave a lasting mark on the world through acts of patronage and piety. But, on the other hand, these women were also very vulnerable. Their destiny was linked to the ups and downs of dynastic politics and the whims of men around them. They faced constant threats to their safety and well-being, from the dangers of childbirth to the threats from rivals and enemies. Some, like Neville, suffered tragedies and disappointments. Their lives were cut short by cruel twists of fate, and even those who managed to carve out a sphere of influence, like Isabel of France, did so at great personal risk. In a world where power was the ultimate prize, a woman who dared to reach for it could easily find herself heading toward the abyss. Perhaps the most striking thing about these stories is the enormous resilience and strength of the women who lived them. Faced with unimaginable adversities, they found a way to resist, adapt, and even prosper. Whether through acts of piety, patronage, or simple political maneuvering, they asserted their ability to act in a world that struggled at every step to deny them. In the end, their stories serve as a powerful reminder of the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit to overcome even the most daunting obstacles. They may have lived in a world very far from ours, but the challenges they faced in love and loss, power and danger, are the same ones that still resonate through the centuries. So, as we close the book on this chapter of history, let's remember these women, not only as queens and consorts, but as people, each with their own story to tell. In doing so, we honor their memory and the enduring legacy they left behind. And with this, we come to the end of our journey through the lives of medieval queens. I hope that, in some way, their stories have shed light on the complex realities of life in the Middle Ages. A world of grandeur and misery, of piety and violence, of love and loss. But more than that, I hope they have served as a reminder of the extraordinary resilience and strength of the human spirit. These women, despite all the challenges they faced, found a way to leave their mark on history through their patronage, their piety, and their willpower. As we fall asleep, let us carry with us their stories, a testament to the enduring power of human experience through time and of cultures. And let us remember that, even in the darkest moments, there is always a ray of light, a glimmer of hope to guide us toward brighter days. Good night and sweet dreams. As we have seen, medieval queens and princesses often saw their lives shaped by forces beyond their control. They were married off to secure alliances, sent to foreign courts, and pressured to have male heirs. But perhaps no aspect of their lives was more distressing and dangerous than the dangers of childbirth. In an era long before modern medicine, obstetric care was at best rudimentary. The midwives who attended most births relied more on folklore and tradition than on scientific knowledge. The concept of hygiene was little known. Childbirth took place in dark, poorly ventilated rooms, in beds stained with the bodily fluids of previous births. Instruments, when used, were not properly cleaned. Not surprisingly, puerperal fever caused by bacterial infections was very common. For a queen, the risks were compounded by the immense pressure to give birth to a male child. The succession of a dynasty and the stability of a kingdom could depend on the sex of a newborn. Imagine giving birth for hours or days in excruciating pain, fearing not only for your own life, but also for the political consequences if you failed to give birth to an heir. The tragic story of Neville, wife of King Richard III, illustrates how dangerous childbirth could be, even for those at the top of society. At just 16 years old, and became Queen of England when her husband seized the throne. An intelligent and influential woman, she gave birth to the couple's only legitimate son, Edward of Middham, around 1476. But only a decade later, both Anne and her young son became seriously ill, probably with tuberculosis. Despite their high position, the doctors could do little. Within months, Anne helplessly watched her son waste away and die. Her own health faltered. She only lived a few more months before succumbing at the Palace of Westminster in March of 1485. She was only 28 years old. Anne's heartbreaking story was very common in an era when medicine was powerless against so many diseases. For every queen who successfully overcame the dangers of childbirth, there were dozens who did not. It is a stark reminder of how fragile life can be, even for those born into privilege and power. Of course, some royal women managed to exert influence and authority despite the limitations imposed on them, but this often required extraordinary willpower and personality. Not only did they have to navigate the dangers of childbirth, but also the ruthless intrigues of court politics. One such formidable figure was Philippa of Hainaut, Queen of England. Wife of King Edward III, married at just 13 years old, Philippa quickly demonstrated her intelligence and political acumen. She managed the royal household with a firm hand and was an important advisor to her husband. But Philippa's most lasting impact may have been as a patron of the arts and scholarship. She sponsored writers like Jean Froissart and provided pensions to scholars at the University of Oxford. The Queen's College of Oxford, founded in 1341, still bears her name today. In an era when women were virtually excluded from formal education, Philippa helped foster the flourishing of knowledge and culture. Her story gives us an idea of how some exceptional women were able to forge their own destiny, even within the rigid limitations of medieval royalty. They may have been political puppets, but they were not always passive. Even so, for the great majority of royal women, the reality of their lives was harder and more limited. Even queens who enjoyed relatively stable and successful marriages could face the precariousness of their position if their husband died. Without a male protector, a widowed queen could quickly become vulnerable to the intrigues of ambitious nobles or a new king's hostility. Some sought security by retiring to convents. Others put themselves at the mercy of relatives. A fortunate few managed to carve out a role as queen regent, using their experience to advise the new ruler. But even this was a precarious existence, always at the mercy of the reigning monarch. For an especially illustrative example, one only has to look at the story of Margarita of Provence, wife of Louis IX of France. Margarita, an intelligent and strong-willed woman, exerted considerable influence over her husband and exercised regency in his absence. But when Louis died in 1270, Margarita's luck quickly changed. Her son, now King Felipe III, distanced himself from her and resented her influence. Faced with growing hostility at court, Margarita embarked on a pilgrimage, traveling to the Holy Land with the hope of gaining allies and support. But the new king outsmarted her, intercepting her letters and turning her own household against her. Increasingly isolated, Margarita ended up exiling herself in Provence, where she lived her last years away from the centers of power that she had once controlled. Her story is a clear example of how quickly a queen's fortunes could change. However powerful or influential she was during her husband's reign, a royal widow could find herself sidelined, marginalized, or even persecuted once a new king ascended the throne. The chessboard of medieval politics was constantly changing, with queens as vulnerable as any piece. Of course, not all queens were exiled or retired quietly. Some, like the infamous Isabel of France, fought against the impotence of their position with impactful force and tenacity. Married to Edward II of England, Isabel resented her husband's abandonment and the undue influence of his male favorites at court. In 1325, she returned to her native France, ostensibly to negotiate a peace treaty. But once there, Isabel began plotting an invasion to dethrone her own husband. With the help of her lover, Roger Mortimer, she gathered an army and sailed to England, where she landed in 1326. The country quickly joined her cause, and Edward II was captured and forced to abdicate in favor of his young son. Isabel then ruled as regent in all but name. It was a surprising turn of events. A woman overthrew the legitimate king, but Isabel's bold move illustrates how high the stakes could be for medieval queens. Deprived of official power, they could still find ways to exert their will, even if it meant resorting to violence and intrigue. Isabel's story is a vivid reminder that, although royal women were often pawns, they were not always passive. Thanks to their cunning, determination, and willpower, a few managed to alter the chessboard and seize some control over their own destiny. But those dramatic blows were the exception, not the rule. For most medieval queens and princesses, life was a constant negotiation of the limits imposed on them by a deeply patriarchal society. Valued mainly for their uteruses, they faced immense pressure to bear male heirs. Subject to the whims of fathers, husbands, and sons, their lives were forever precarious. Some found autonomy through religious devotion or the patronage of arts. Others forged alliances and wielded subtle power behind the scenes. A tenacious few even managed to rule as regents or exert obvious political influence. But none could completely escape the brutal reality of their position. In a world where power was the exclusive preserve of men, royal women faced a constant struggle to forge their own destiny. The dangers of childbirth, the capricious dynastic politics, the imminent threat of marginalization or exile were the inescapable conditions of their lives. And so we return to that drafty castle room, to the exhausted figure of the medieval queen, contemplating her narrow world of tapestries and smoky fires. She may live surrounded by grandeur, dressed in silks and jewels, and burdened with a vast retinue. But she knows that her true value is measured only by the children she can have. Her power, her own survival, is always contingent. It is a somber portrait, a sobering antidote to our romantic ideas of medieval royalty. But it is also a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of women who endured these hardships. Deprived of autonomy, beset by dangers, they nevertheless found ways to leave their mark on history. In their stories, in the triumphs and tragedies, in acts of piety, patronage, and intrigue, we glimpse lives lived under extraordinary pressure, and we remember that, even in the most adverse circumstances, the human spirit has an amazing capacity to resist and even to defy. So let us spare a thought for Matilda and Ellalinina, for Anna and Felipe, Margarita and Isabel, and for the innumerable anonymous royal women whose names have been lost to history. Hers was a brutal and often ungrateful existence, but one which, nevertheless, marked the course of nations and dynasties. By remembering their struggles, we honor their courage and tenacity in the face of overwhelming adversity. As the candles flickered in the drafty room, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls, Margarita of Provence squeezed her rosary and prayed fervently. She was about to embark on a dangerous journey, a pilgrimage that would take her away from the relative safety and comfort of the royal court. In the 13th century, undertaking a religious pilgrimage was one of the few occasions when a queen could undertake such a long journey. The Church wholeheartedly approved of these acts of public piety on the part of the women of royalty. Margarita, wife of the celebrated French king Louis IX, had promised to make a pilgrimage to the Abbey of Cluny if her husband returned safe from the Seventh Crusade. When Louis finally returned to French soil after 6 long years of absence, Margarita immediately set out to fulfill her promise to God. She would travel from Paris to the famous Abbey of Burgundy, a journey of almost 320 kilometers, an immense distance in an era in which most people rarely ventured more than a few kilometers from their birthplace. For a queen, undertaking such a long and arduous journey was no small feat. The roads were dangerous, often little more than muddy, bumpy paths that snaked through dense forests and rugged hills. Bandits and highwaymen represented a constant threat to travelers. In addition, a royal retinue required large amounts of provisions, not to mention the expensive gifts offered at sacred sites along the way. Margarita would have traveled on horseback or in an uncomfortable carriage that shook constantly. Bad weather could easily turn roads into impassable mud. However, as difficult as the physical journey was, it was nothing compared to the political dangers faced by a queen who left her king's side for an extended time. Margarita's absence from court created a dangerous vacuum that rival factions sought to fill. Courtiers murmured and conspired, always attentive to any shift in the balance of power. A queen's influence was always fragile in a world where power came from proximity to the monarch. For Margarita, embarking on her sacred pilgrimage meant giving up her important role as Louis's most faithful confidant and advisor. Despite the risks, Margarita was determined to fulfill her sacred vow. With a small retinue of ladies-in-waiting, clerics, and armed men, the queen departed from Paris. The bells of a Notre Dame cathedral tolled solemnly behind her. The trip to Cluny would be long and difficult. The roads were as treacherous as feared. But for Margarita, the arduous pilgrimage offered a unique opportunity to break free, if only for a time, from the suffocating confines and intrigues of courtly life. As she moved slowly forward, the queen's thoughts undoubtedly turned to the sacred relics and sights that awaited her. Margarita looked forward to spending a few days in quiet prayer and contemplation in the silent cloisters of the Abbey of Cluny. There, in the presence of sacred relics, such as the supposed finger bone of San Juan Bautista, she would plead with the Almighty to bless and protect her husband, her children, and the kingdom of Francia. The pilgrimage to Cluny was not to be Margarita's only foray into the uncertain world beyond the castle walls. However, years later, the queen would be forced to embark on a journey, not on a sacred pilgrimage, but into exile. When Margarita's eldest son, Felipe, assumed the throne after his father's death, he hastened to marginalize the influence of his strong-willed mother. Resentful of the queen's meddling and her iron grip on the royal treasury, Felipe banished his mother from court and Margarita settled in Reims, the coronation site of the French kings. There, as if defying her relegation to the margins of politics, the queen established a kind of rival court. She attracted to her orbit loyal courtiers and dignitaries, to whom she dispensed favors and charity. Despite her son's efforts to marginalize her, Margarita refused to relinquish the power and prestige to which she had become accustomed as Queen of Francia. Even in exile, the indomitable queen continued to exert her influence from afar. Through letters and envoys, she made known her discontent with Felipe's policies and appointments. The new king soon learned that banishment alone was not enough to silence a woman as astute and tenacious as Margarita of Provence. Her decades in the heart of the royal court had taught the queen to navigate the treacherous currents of power. As such, Margarita's story vividly illustrates the fragile position of even the most exalted women in medieval society. For a queen, especially one known for her ambition and political acumen, the threat of exile was ever present. A queen served to the king's will. If she overstepped or displeased him, she could quickly find herself expelled from the royal presence, stripped of her power and influence. However, exile, like pilgrimage, also offered the women of royalty a degree of autonomy and freedom of action that was rarely possible within the strict structures of courtly life. Away from the watchful eye of the monarch, an exiled queen could more freely cultivate her own base of support and influence. Indeed, Margarita of Provence remained a force to be reckoned with, even from her banishment in Reims. The experiences of Margarita and so many of her royal sisters highlight the peculiar paradox faced by medieval queens. Their high status provided them with immense privileges, wealth, and access to power. However, that same exalted rank also made them highly vulnerable to the whims and suspicions of their husbands and sons. A queen, even one who wore a crown and sat on a throne, was still subject to male authority. Ultimately, undertaking a pilgrimage or facing exile were two sides of the same coin for women like Margarita. They were occasions in which the strict rules and scrutiny of their lives were relaxed, if only briefly. In those rare moments of relative freedom and autonomy, some royal women found opportunities to be themselves, to exercise power and influence on their own terms. The road could be fraught with dangers, whether traveling to a sacred sanctuary or banished from court, but it offered a tempting glimpse of a life less limited by the demands of others. For the indomitable Margarita of Provenza, neither pilgrimage nor exile could keep her from the heart of power for long. This queen understood better than most how to navigate the treacherous landscape of medieval politics. Her years of devotion and service to Louis IX had earned her a reputation as a woman of great piety and wisdom, a formidable figure who inspired respect and loyalty. Even when she was temporarily removed from the king's side, Margarita refused to give up her hard-won authority. As she walked the arduous path to the Cluny Abbey so many years ago, she squeezed the rosary tightly between her hands. Margarita undoubtedly drew strength and determination from her faith. In a world where the winds of power and danger could change without warning, the queen had learned to trust her unwavering sense of duty. Whatever happened, pilgrimage or exile, power or persecution, Margarita of Provenza would stand firm. For this fearsome medieval queen, adversity was just another challenge to be faced with the unwavering resistance that had characterized her extraordinary life. The life of a medieval queen was paradoxical. For the common people, these royal women lived surrounded by unimaginable luxury and every comfort. But behind the castle walls hid a harsh and precarious existence in which not even the ladies of the bluest blood were immune to the numerous dangers of the time. Power was a double-edged sword. It provided prestige, but it also made whoever held it an easy target in a world where fortune could change in the blink of an eye. Perhaps no one embodied these contradictions better than Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born into nobility as Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, she was famous throughout Europe for her beauty, her intelligence, and her considerable inheritance. These qualities made Eleanor a highly coveted bride, and at only 15 years old, she married King Louis VI of France in 1137. Although such an illustrious marriage might seem like a fairy tale ending, the reality was far from idyllic. Eleanor resented the restrictions imposed on her by the pious and austere French court. The king was more interested in religious devotion than in romantic love, and the couple grew increasingly distant. During her marriage, Eleanor accompanied Louis on the unfortunate Second Crusade to the Holy Land, an arduous journey even for the most resistant men, and much more so for a young queen. The expedition was a failure on many fronts, and there were rumors that Eleanor had an affair with her uncle Raymond while in Antioch. Although it was never proven, the scandal further strained her relationship with Louis. Upon their return, the couple soon requested the annulment of the marriage due to consanguinity, since they were actually distant cousins. The convenient discovery of this blood tie provided them with a way to save appearances and end their unhappy union. At 30 years old, Eleanor found herself once again in the marriage market, although in this case she was a highly sought-after bride. Her vast lands made her a very attractive candidate for many powerful suitors. Barely 2 months after her annulment, she hastily married the young Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. It was a challenging marriage that surprised many, as Henry was the rival and enemy of her former husband, Louis. This second marriage proved more passionate, but no less tumultuous. Henry and Eleanor had a very intense relationship and often clashed, as both had strong personalities and were used to getting their way. When Henry ascended the English throne in 1154, Eleanor was crowned Queen of England. Over the next 13 years, she gave birth to 8 children, including 5 boys, finally fulfilling the important duty of providing male heirs. But Eleanor was not a passive consort who was content to remain in the background. She continued to actively participate in the government, often acting as regent in Henry's absence. Her court in Poitiers became a renowned center of courtly love and art, in contrast to the rougher and more violent pastimes that Henry preferred, such as hunting and war. As her children grew, family disputes intensified into open rebellion, with Eleanor's children rising up against their father, probably with her tacit support. Outraged by this betrayal, Henry had Eleanor arrested and imprisoned for treason. She spent the next 16 years under house arrest, mostly confined to various royal properties. Only after Henry's death in 1189 was Eleanor finally released by her son, the now King Richard the Lionheart. In a surprising turn of events, Eleanor, almost 70 years old, returned to the sphere of power by assuming the role of regent, while Richard embarked on his crusade. Despite her advanced age, the indomitable queen traveled throughout Europe to negotiate Richard's marriage and his ransom when he was captured. Eleanor's final years as a veteran stateswoman marked the triumphant final chapter of a turbulent life that saw dramatic changes of fortune. Her story embodied the dizzying heights and abysmal depths that defined the capricious lives of even the most elite women of the Middle Ages. From the glittering courts to the damp prison cells, the ever-present specters of dynastic maneuvering, forbidden loves, and shifting loyalties meant that no queen, however powerful, was truly safe. In fact, if the tests of Eleanor of Aquitaine demonstrated anything, it was that the brilliant adornments of royal power were sustained in the cold, hard reality of medieval marriage and maternity. Even for the most elevated women of the era, their principal value resided in their uteruses and in the children they could bear to continue the family lineage. This implacable pressure overshadowed queens from the moment they contracted marriage. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was an incredibly dangerous enterprise for women of all social classes. But for royal women, what was at stake was amplified by the added political implications. The fertility of a queen was a question of dynastic urgency, since the succession and the stability of entire kingdoms often depended on her capacity to give birth to healthy children. However, the medical knowledge of the Middle Ages was lamentably insufficient to guarantee safe childbirths. The childbirth was an agonizing and potentially deadly experience, and the queens remained confined in dark and without ventilation rooms during the last weeks of the pregnancy to protect the baby from the evil spirits. They were attended by midwives of diverse skill based on a combination of popular wisdom, prayers, and dubious concoctions to alleviate the pains of childbirth. The hygiene was rudimentary in the best of the cases, with rooms full of rushes to absorb the abundant blood and the fluids of the childbirth. It is estimated that around 5% of the childbirths ended with the death of the mother, in the majority of the cases by infection. In the case of royalty, the rate was probably even higher, given how frequently the queens stayed pregnant. And Neville, wife of King Richard III of England, suffered an especially heartbreaking reproductive struggle. Married at only 16 years old in 1472, and faced enormous pressure to give an heir to the House of York. Her first pregnancy ended in spontaneous abortion, a devastating but very common outcome. In 1473, and finally gave birth to a son, Edward of Middleham. The kingdom rejoiced at the arrival of a male heir that would consolidate the right of the Yorks to the throne. But only 2 years later, tragedy struck when the small prince got sick and passed away suddenly, and was understandably heartbroken by the loss of her only son. Worse still, and herself was left transformed from the birthing bed. Described in her day as a great beauty, her health was now shattered, possibly because of a difficult childbirth or postpartum infection. She became increasingly fragile and withdrawn, a shadow of her old, vibrant self. As one chronicler pointed out, she was consumed by pain, despite her fragile state, and conceived again at the end of 1484. This would be her last pregnancy, since she died in March of 1485 at only 28 years old. The cause was probably related to the physical strain accumulated by the pregnancies, aggravated by her poor state of general health. Richard III was shattered by the death of his beloved queen, and only 5 months later, he also met his death in the Battle of Bosworth Field. The moving history of and Neville highlights the implacable physical where that the reproduction supposed for the body of the women of the medieval royalty, considered little more than vessels to perpetuate the dynasties. The queens had very little rest between pregnancies to recover, which put enormous strain on their health. The pressure to continue producing heirs was relentless, even in the face of spontaneous abortions, stillbirths, and infant mortality. This cycle of gestation was also deeply intertwined with the political maneuvers that dominated courtly life. The status of a queen was usually directly related to her reproductive success, and her influence and security increased or diminished with the births and deaths of her children, especially the males. The inability to conceive was considered a personal and moral failure, more than a quirk of biological destiny. Beyond the alcove, medieval queens were expected to be paradigms of piety and virtue, and to set an example of religious devotion for their subjects. The ideal queen had to be a companion that helped her husband, an obedient consort that submitted to his authority. In reality, this submissive appearance used to hide an astute political instinct, and the most intelligent queens found ways to exert their influence in an informal way. A common way for queens to exert their power was to sponsor institutions and religious causes. To found abbeys, arsenals, and hospitals was a way to show publicly the magnanimity and the piety, at the same time that a network of clergymen and loyal vassals was created. These acts of ostentatious piety served to counteract the frequent rumors about the queen's lasciviousness and meddling that circulated through the court. Philippa of Hainaut, wife of King Edward III of England, knew how to skillfully handle these expectations during her 3 decades as queen. Venerated for her compassion and generosity, she endowed the Queen's College of the University of Oxford with the objective of providing education to poor students. She was also a great patron of the arts, and hired minstrels and poets to entertain in her animated court. But perhaps Philippa's most enduring legacy was her influence on the following Plantagenet generation. She was a trusted advisor to her older son, Edward, the famous Black Prince, and cultivated his gifts of leadership and his civic ideals. When the king fell into madness, it was Philippa who helped manage the transition of power to her capable heir. As mother of an impressive offspring of 12 children that survived to adulthood, Philippa fulfilled her duty and more to propagate the Plantagenet line. Her fecundity, combined with her affable but firm character, turned her into a formidable queen who inspired genuine respect instead of reluctant obedience. When she passed away in 1369, she was deeply mourned as much by the king as by the kingdom. In many senses, Philippa of Hainaut represented the ideal medieval queen, a fertile and decorous consort who provided wise advice without leaving a second plane. But this paradigm was not one to which all royal women could adjust or wanted to. In a world in which the limits between the personal and the political were very diffuse, some queens could not resist the temptation to test the limits of their feminine authority. Perhaps no medieval queen went as far as Isabel of France. Only surviving daughter of King Philippe IV of France, Isabel was married to King Edoardo II of England in 1308 at the tender age of 12 years. It was a classic diplomatic alliance designed to alleviate the tensions between the two kingdoms. But the marriage soon soured, since Edoardo's blatant favoritism towards his male courtiers, especially Hugh Despenser the Younger, alienated Isabel. In 1325, the agreement between the royal couple had reached its breaking point. With the excuse of negotiating a peace treaty with France, Isabel fled to Paris and refused to return to England while the Despensers remained in the court. From exile, she began conspiring to overthrow her husband with the help of her lover, Roger Mortimer. In a surprising change of gender roles, Isabel gathered a mercenary army and invaded England in 1326, gathering the discontented nobles to her cause. Abandoned by his followers and captured by Isabel's forces, Edoardo II was forced to abdicate in favor of his adolescent son, who became King Edoardo III. Although Isabel claimed that she was acting as regent on behalf of her son, it soon became clear that she and Mortimer were the true power behind the throne. For 4 years, the couple ruled England in everything but name, using their position to enrich themselves and eliminate their enemies. It was a surprising turn of events in an era in which women, much less queens, were expected to be apolitical and submissive. Isabel's blatant actions earned her the nickname of the She-Wolf of France for her ruthless pursuit of power. But Isabel's strategy went too far for the English nobility, who could not bear to be governed by an adulterous queen born abroad and her upstart lover. In 1330, the young King Edoardo III asserted his authority by staging a palace coup, arresting Mortimer and executing him for treason. As for Isabel, she was banished from court and forced to live the rest of her days in anonymity in a remote castle. The dramatic rise and fall of Isabel of France embodied the razor's edge on which medieval queens had to walk. Operating in the gray area between explicit and implicit power, they had to tread carefully to assert their influence. A misstep could mean disgrace, exile, or even death in a relentless political landscape. Because, while royalty conferred great privileges and prestige, it also entailed profound vulnerability and precariousness. The women of royalty were always one step away from disaster. A misstep, a sterile uterus, a malicious rumor. In a world where dynastic ambition prevailed, queens were often no more than pawns that were exchanged, tolerated, and discarded in the great game of politics. This reality was perhaps reflected more viscerally in the dangers of pilgrimage and exile that loomed over many medieval queens. In an era of ostentatious piety, going on pilgrimage was one of the few acceptable reasons for royal women to venture outside their domestic sphere. These trips offered a rare opportunity for adventure and autonomy, a chance to escape the suffocating confines of the court. But pilgrimage was also an immensely arduous and dangerous undertaking during the Middle Ages. Travel was slow and uncomfortable on bumpy roads and stormy seas. Bandits and diseases posed a constant threat, willing to end even the bluest-blooded travelers. Many queens undertook pilgrimages not only for spiritual edification, but also for political convenience, whether as penance for perceived transgressions or as a show of contrition to ease tensions. For Margarita of Provence, consort of Louis IX of France, the pilgrimage turned out to be a source of both comfort and pain. A deeply devout woman, Margarita accompanied her equally pious husband on his first crusade to Egypt in 1248. It was a disastrous campaign, culminating in Louis's capture by the Mamluks. Margarita, who was pregnant at the time, managed to gather the enormous ransom to free Louis and the men who had survived. But the terrible experience left them with physical and mental after-effects, and Louis swore to undertake another crusade to atone for his failure. In 1270, the royal couple left again, this time towards Tunis, but they never reached their destination. Louis died of dysentery during the trip, leaving Margarita devastated. Now a widow, Margarita returned to France to serve as regent for her young son. But her control of power was weak, and she was soon surpassed by her own brother-in-law. In a final humiliation, Margarita was practically banished from the court and forced to retire to her lands in Provence. It was a bitter end to a life marked by both the heights of royalty and the capricious twists of fortune. The journey of Margarita of Provence summarizes the dizzying vicissitudes that define the lives of medieval queens. Hers was an existence on a tightrope, always in balance between the sacred and the struggle, the exalted and the insecure. Not even the most apparently stable royal marriages could protect them from the ever-present threats of political eclipse, exile, and erasure. Not even the most stable of royal marriages could protect them from the ever-present threats of political eclipse, exile, and dethronement. After all, medieval queens were hostages to both their fickle biology and the relentless forces of dynasty. Their value was measured in heirs and offspring, and their persons were used as diplomatic bargaining chips. They lived under the weight of relentless scrutiny, and each of their movements and words was analyzed for signs of scandal or sedition. And yet, despite all the dangers and the precariousness of their position, queens also had a unique and visible platform from which to influence events. Through the levers of the soft power of patronage, pilgrimages, and piety, they could carve out spheres of influence that contradicted their apparent subordinate condition. Behind the placid mask of royal composure lay hidden reserves of resistance and ingenuity that sustained them throughout the many trials of their office. In the tapestry of medieval history, the stories of these royal women form a bright but bloody thread. Theirs was a sisterhood united by the shared experiences of dangerous childbirths, loveless marriages, and capricious fortunes. Even the most powerful among them walked on a razor's edge. Their destinies ultimately depended on the whims of their fathers, husbands, and sons. Looking back and contemplating their lives from a modern perspective is to marvel at the strength it took to survive in a world so hostile to their will. For every Eleanor of Aquitaine who managed to carve out a modicum of self-determination, there were dozens of forgotten queens who languished in anonymity, valued only for their fertility or their usefulness to the dynastic project. Their names may have disappeared from the historical records, but their collective struggles resonate through the centuries, a testament to the unwavering and often unseen strength of the medieval woman. Theirs was a sisterhood of survival in a world where femininity itself was an act of tightrope walking between the sacred and profane. In the end, perhaps the greatest legacy left by these queens of yesteryear is the enduring example of their resistance in the face of unimaginable adversity. They navigated the treacherous currents of courtly life with an elegance and determination that belied the golden cage of their kingdom. In doing so, they left an indelible mark on the annals of history with each defiant breath. The regal beauty and luxurious elegance of Isabel of France masked a steely determination and an astute political mind. Born in 1295 within the powerful Capetian dynasty of France, Isabel was sent to England at the tender age of 12 to marry the English king Edward II. It was an agreement intended to foster peace between the two kingdoms. But it was not a happy union. Edward was an ineffective ruler, little interested in the government or his young wife. He lavished favors and power on his male favorites, provoking the resentment of the English nobles. The despised Isabel found herself isolated and powerless in a foreign court, her royal authority eclipsed by the whims of her irresponsible husband. But Isabel did not resign herself to irrelevance. She waited patiently, cultivating allies in silence, and awaiting the opportune moment to act. That moment arrived in 1325, when tensions between England and France were rekindled. Edward sent Isabel to negotiate with her brother, King Charles IV of France. It was a fateful decision. Once safe in her native France, Isabel revealed her true intentions. She refused to return to England until Edward expelled his favorites from the court. Outraged, Edward refused, but Isabel had another card to play. She had fallen in love with a handsome English nobleman, Roger Mortimer. Together, they plotted a bold plan to invade England and dethrone Edward. With her son, the future Edward III, as a front, Isabel and Mortimer landed on the English coast in 1326 with a small mercenary army. To their surprise, support for their cause grew at an astonishing rate. The disgruntled nobles joined the rebellious queen, and Edward's regime collapsed with hardly any struggle. The king was forced to abdicate in favor of his young son, with Isabel as regent. Finally, the queen, for so long ignored, had taken the reins of power into her own hands. Edward was imprisoned and then executed in a gruesome manner, supposedly with a red-hot poker stuck in his entrails. The gruesome rumors about his death only reinforced Isabel's formidable reputation. For 4 years, Isabel and Mortimer ruled England with an iron fist, enriching themselves and purging the kingdom of their remaining enemies. But their ruthless regime generated resentment, and in 1330, Edward III, 18 years old, reasserted his royal authority with a counterblow. Mortimer was hanged as a traitor, and Isabel was relegated to a quiet retirement with a generous pension. The she-wolf of France, as her enemies called her, had orchestrated the first successful invasion of England since the Norman conquest 3 centuries earlier. Her astonishing trajectory, from girl bride to rebellious queen and dethroned regent, was a testament to her indomitable will and sharp political instinct. In an era when royal women were considered little more than dynastic chess pieces, Isabel boldly rewrote the rules. Through astute politics, brazen adultery, and even open war, she fought her way to the apex of power. Although her reign was ephemeral, Isabel's dramatic life served as a powerful reminder. Even in the male-dominated world of the medieval monarchy, formidable queens could still disrupt the political order. As the chaos of Isabel's era faded into memory, England was forced to deal with the disturbing implications of her story. How much power could a queen be allowed to wield? What were the consequences when family ties and feudal obligations clashed? These questions would resonate throughout centuries of English history, as new generations of royal women navigated the treacherous currents of courtly intrigue and dynastic politics. Isabel's own granddaughter, Philippa of Hainaut, would become one of the most influential queen consorts of medieval England. But Philippa's power was of a decidedly different nature than Isabel's. While Isabel had taken center stage thanks to her audacity and cunning, Philippa would work behind the scenes, acting as a trusted advisor to her husband and generous patron of letters. Born in 1310 or 1311 in the Netherlands, in what is now Belgium, Philippa was the daughter of the Count of Holland. At the age of 9, she was betrothed to the future Edward III of England, Isabel's son. It was a splendid union destined to strengthen the vital commercial ties between the Netherlands and England. In 1328, a jubilant Philippa arrived in London to celebrate a magnificent royal wedding. By all accounts, the marriage was a success both personally and politically. The young couple fit well together and fell sincerely in love. When Edward launched his bold attempt to claim the French crown, unleashing the 100 Years' War, Philippa accompanied him on campaign, even giving birth to her son in a tent on the battlefield. But it was in the domestic sphere where Philippa truly shone. She served as regent in her husband's absence, managing the kingdom's affairs with wisdom and care. She spoke several languages fluently and maintained diplomatic relations across Europe. In addition, she became a celebrated patron of the arts, education, and literature. Philippa financed the expansion of the famous universities of Oxford and Cambridge and supported scholars such as Jean Froissart, whose chronicles remain an invaluable window into the life of the 14th century. She was known for her piety and generosity, as she distributed alms among the poor and founded religious houses such as the famous Queen's College of Oxford. Despite having at least a dozen children, including another future king, John of Gaunt, Philippa remained a vibrant presence at court until her final years. When Edward III founded the Order of the Garter, Philippa was named its First Lady, a signal honor. Her death in 1369 was deeply mourned by both the kingdom and king. The poet Geoffrey Chaucer, who owed his initial success to Philippa's patronage, composed verses in her honor, praising her virtue and her noble spirit. In Philippa, England had found a queen who perfectly embodied the medieval ideal, devout and loyal, cultured and elegant. But not even a role model like Philippa was immune to the harsh realities faced by royal women during the Middle Ages. The dangers of childbirth overshadowed Philippa throughout her marriage. At least 3 of her children died young. And despite the genuine affection between Philippa and Edward, she remained a stranger in a strange land, sent from court to court to serve the interests of men. It was a theme that was repeated again and again in the lives of medieval queens and princesses. Whether forging their own path, like the bold Isabel, or working within the limitations of their role, like the esteemed Philippa, these women walked a dangerous tightrope. The splendor of their rank was always haunted by the specter of political turmoil and personal tragedy. As the Middle Ages progressed, the dangers and pressures faced by royal women would only increase. The age of chivalry was giving way to the cold calculations of the Renaissance. As a new generation of kings and queens struggled for power in an increasingly complex European scenario in this treacherous new world, the role of the royal consort would be more difficult than ever before. But that is perhaps a story for another time. For now, we leave Philippa of Hainaut to her well-deserved rest and a rebellious Queen Isabel to her complicated legacy. 2 very different women who led very different lives, but both inextricably linked by the demands and limitations imposed on medieval royalty. As we let the mists of time settle over them, we are left to reflect on the harsh truths that their stories reveal about power, femininity, and the capricious twists of history. These are questions that transcend any era and resonate with us today with an enduring urgency. In the triumphs and tragedies of long-gone queens, we can still find glimpses of our own struggles and aspirations refracted through the prism of the past. So let us wish good night to Philippa and Isabel, and to all the royal women of the Middle Ages, whose lives were so often marked by danger and precariousness. May their stories continue to instruct and inspire us as we work to build a world in which birth circumstances no longer determine the course of people's lives. And may we always remember the brave courage of those who came before us, opening paths in unknown territories with elegance, determination, and unwavering resolution. As the candles burn out and the first rays of dawn peak over the horizon, we close the chapter on another era, with the assurance that the lessons it contains are not lost to time, but patiently await our discovery. Like a faithful chronicler watching over the centuries, history is ready to illuminate our present and guide our steps towards an ever-evolving future. And so we sleep, with the opportunity to dream of righteous Philippas and fierce Isabels and all the untold stories that hide between the lines of history books. Because, after all, it is the human heart that animates the great tapestry of time. And it is there, in the moments of silence and in the anonymous struggles, where the true essence of our shared past is woven, stitch by stitch. As the tumultuous history of Isabel of France reminds us, even the most powerful and privileged women in medieval society walked a precarious tightrope. The resplendent crowns and sumptuous dresses concealed a darker reality, one of uncertainty, danger, and often tragedy. For our next heroine, we travel to the wind-swept moors of northern England in the year 1349. In the middle of the shadows that close on the castle of Durham, a young royal bride prepares to know her destiny. She is Juana, daughter of Edward III, King of England. At only 13 years old, she has been promised in marriage to Pedro de Castilla, the newly crowned King of Spain. The marriage of Juana to Pedro was a political masterstroke designed to consolidate the nascent alliance between England and Castilla. But for the young princess, it meant saying goodbye to everything she had known. Sent to the other side of the sea, to an unknown land, it was expected that Juana navigate through the treacherous waters of the Castilian court, being still a girl. The first days of Juana's marriage were marked by loneliness and fear. Pedro, known in history as the Cruel, was a ruthless and capricious ruler with a penchant for violence. He showed no interest in his young wife, preferring the company of his lover, Maria de Padilla. With the passage of years, Juana felt increasingly isolated and unhappy. She was a stranger in an unknown land, far from the comfort and support of her family. Her duties as queen, to supervise the royal house, to dispense patronage, and even to give an heir, were made difficult by the indifference of her husband and the machinations of the Castilian nobles. However, even facing so much adversity, Juana persevered. She gained a reputation for piety and charity, earning the affection of the common people. When the Black Plague arrived in Castilla in 1361, Juana worked tirelessly to alleviate the suffering in her adopted homeland, even while mourning the loss of her first son. But Juana's biggest test was still to come. In 1366, her husband Pedro was overthrown in a coup led by his half-brother Enrique de Trastamara. Suddenly, the one that had been the powerful queen of Castilla found herself prisoner, captive of the forces of Enrique. For 6 long years, Juana languished in captivity, her destiny uncertain. Only thanks to the tireless efforts of her father, Edward III, was she freed. In 1372, at 33 years old and forever marked by her terrible experience, Juana finally returned to England, the homeland she had left behind so long ago. Juana's story is a moving reminder of the powerlessness that even women of the highest birth could face in the medieval world. Buffeted by political winds beyond their control, their very survival often hung by a thread. And yet, again and again, these women found reserves of resilience that belied their apparent fragility. Through acts of piety, charity, and strength of will, they carved out spheres of influence that transcended the limitations imposed on them. One of these figures was Philippa of Hainaut, Queen of England and wife of Edward III. Although her marriage, like so many other royal marriages, was arranged for political reasons, Philippa proved to be a capable and influential consort. As a patron of the arts, she helped foster a cultural renaissance in the English court. The Queen sponsored minstrels, poets, and scholars, transforming her adopted homeland into a center of learning and creativity. She even played a key role in the foundation of Queen's College at the University of Oxford, one of the oldest and most prestigious institutions of higher education in the world. But the influence of Philippa extended much more beyond the scope of the arts and the letters. She was a skillful diplomat who was often called upon to mediate disputes and negotiate alliances. When the kingdom faced the ravages of the 100 Years' War, Philippa served as regent in her husband's absence, skillfully overseeing the government of the kingdom. Perhaps most remarkable is that the marriage of Philippa and Edward III seems to have been a genuinely affectionate union. The couple had 12 children, and, according to all indications, the king depended to a great extent on the advice and the support of his queen. When Philippa died in 1369, it is said that Edward was inconsolable with grief. In many ways, Philippa of Hainaut represents the ideal of feminine royalty in the medieval world. A woman who, thanks to her intelligence, elegance, and strength of character, transcended the limitations imposed on her gender to become a true partner in government. But even for a queen as capable as Philippa, life was far from a fairy tale. The spectrum of death hovered on the medieval world, and the women of the royalty were not exempt from its scope. In an epoch previous to the modern medicine, the childbirth was a dangerous enterprise that charged the life of innumerable women, so much commoners as noble. Among the most tragic stories is that of Neville, Queen of England and wife of Richard III. Daughter of the powerful Neville family, Anna was not foreign to the turbulent political panorama of the England of the 15th century. Her father, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, was a key figure in the Wars of the Roses, a bloody civil conflict that pitted the houses of Lancaster and York against each other in a battle for the English throne. Like so many medieval women, Anne's destiny was inextricably tied to the political fortunes of the men in her life. When her father fell out of favor with King Edward IV of the House of York, and her sister Isabel were married to Edward's younger brothers, George and Richard, in an attempt to reinforce the fragile peace. But the calm would not last long. In 1471, the father and the husband of Anna died in combat against the forces of Eduardo, leaving her widow at the tender age of 14 years. Her lands and titles were seized, and she was placed under the guardianship of her brother-in-law, the future Richard III. What followed was a whirlwind courtship that scandalized the English court. Apparently, Richard had fallen deeply in love with his young protégé and was determined to make her queen. In a secret ceremony, the two married, to the dismay of those who saw in this union a flagrant power grab. As Queen of England, Neville's life was marked by both triumph and tragedy. She gave Richard's son Edward, securing the York dynasty's dominance on the throne. But the young prince's life would be tragically cut short. He died at only 10 years old, and herself would not long survive her son. In March of 1485, after months of illness, the queen died at 28. To this day, the cause of her death remains a mystery, and some speculate that she may have succumbed to tuberculosis or even poisoning. Richard III, who had moved heaven and earth to make and his wife, was heartbroken by the loss. In a letter written shortly after her death, he described his queen as a good, kind, and very virtuous lady who lived her life in a Christian way. But even in death, Neville could not escape the turmoil of the era in which she lived. Barely 5 months after her death, Richard himself was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field, ending the York dynasty and marking the beginning of the Tudor era. As we reach the end of our journey through the lives of the women of medieval royalty, it is impossible not to be impressed by the enormous resilience and strength they demonstrated in the face of unimaginable adversities. From the political machinations of Eleanor of Aquitaine to the piety of Philippa of Hainaut, from the tenacity of Matilda of England to the tragedy of Neville, these women navigated a world that was both dazzling and treacherous, where power and danger often went together. Their stories remind us in a moving way that, even in the highest spheres of society, medieval women faced challenges and limitations that today seem almost unimaginable to us. Traded like cattle to consolidate political alliances, confined to the roles of wife and mother, and eternally at the mercy of men who controlled their destiny. However, these women found ways to assert their agency and influence history. They founded abbeys and sponsored the arts, served as regents and advisors to kings, and performed acts of charity that inspired the masses. Medieval queens and princesses carved out spheres of influence that transcended limitations imposed on their gender. Their legacy endures not only in the pages of history books, but in the very fabric of the world in which we live today. From the high arches of the Gothic cathedrals to the sacred halls of the ancient universities, the footprint of medieval royalty can be seen and felt throughout the centuries. So the next time you find yourself strolling through a ruined castle or preserving and admiring a luminous work of medieval art, take a moment to remember the women whose stories so often go untold. The queens and princesses who, with their courage, resilience, and unwavering spirit, helped shape the course of history. In their tales of triumphs and tragedies, of power and danger, perhaps find a glimpse of our own struggles and aspirations reflected through centuries. Because, after all, the human experience transcends time and space and connects us all in a tapestry of shared hopes, dreams, and challenges. And so we come to the end of our journey through the annals of medieval royalty. As we fall asleep, let's carry with us the stories of these extraordinary women, their triumphs and their tragedies, their joys and their sorrows. Let us remember that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit has an extraordinary capacity to resist and renew itself. Let us draw strength and inspiration from the example of those who came before us, facing the challenges of their era with courage, elegance, and an unwavering determination to leave their mark on the world. Good night, dear listeners, and sweet dreams. May the stories of the medieval queens remind us that, even in the face of adversity, the human spirit can reach extraordinary heights. May we all find within ourselves that same spark of resilience and hope which guided these extraordinary women through the trials and tribulations of their era. Because, after all, their stories are our stories, a testament to the enduring power of the human experience and a reminder that, even in the darkest moments, light and hope can be found. As we have seen, the life of royal women in the Middle Ages was often a precarious balance between duty, danger, and fleeting influence. But perhaps no queen exemplifies this tumultuous existence as much as Margaret of Provence. Born in 1221, daughter of the Count of Provence, Margaret was married at the tender age of 13 to King Louis IX of France, 20 years older than her. She arrived at the northern court without knowing how to speak French, surrounded by courtiers who despised her Provençal entourage. Young and isolated, Margaret nevertheless gave herself to the role of queen, giving birth to 11 children during her marriage. But Margaret's real test came in 1248 when Louis left for the Seventh Crusade, determined to recover Jerusalem from the hands of the Muslims. Appointed regent in her husband's absence, the 27-year-old queen suddenly found herself with the weight of the French kingdom on her shoulders. It was an overwhelming task. With the king absent, unrest spread among the nobles, and the people resented the high taxes to finance the crusade. Margaret had to use all her wit and charm to maintain peace by making strategic appointments, negotiating with rebellious lords, and representing the monarchy with grace and firmness. But even as she gained power, danger lurked around every corner. Assassins were a constant threat. One of Margaret's own cousins was murdered in her bed, and there was always a risk that Louis would not return from the crusade, leaving his sons right to the throne vulnerable. Fortunately, Louis returned in 1254, with his army decimated by battle and disease. But Margaret's relief was short-lived. Some years later, the pious king announced his intention to embark on another crusade. This time, despite the strong objections of Margarita, he insisted that she accompany him. And so, in 1270, the 49-year-old queen found herself on a ship to Tunis, knowing very well the dangers that awaited her. Her worst fears came true when dysentery spread through the Crusader camp, affecting the king and commoners. Louis IX breathed his last breath in a suffocating tent outside the walls of Tunis, leaving Margarita heartbroken and alone in a foreign land far from home. But even in despair, the queen gathered her strength one last time. With the same strength that had helped her overcome decades of turmoil, Margarita rallied the Crusaders and negotiated a treaty with the Yammer of Tunis. Only then did she accompany her husband's body back to France for burial in the Basilica of St. Denis. Margarita spent her last years in quiet piety, retiring to a convent that she had founded. She had endured a lifetime of uncertainty and loss, always striving to keep balance in the midst of chaos. Her story reminds us of the extraordinary resilience of medieval queens who navigated the razor's edge between power and danger with elegance under pressure. But Margarita of Provence was not the only royal woman who left her mark on the Middle Ages. Across the Channel, in England, another formidable queen was navigating the tangle of medieval politics. Her name was Leonor of Castile, and she was, in many ways, the archetype of a medieval queen. Beautiful, pious, and totally dedicated to her husband, King Edward I. But beneath that conventional surface beat the heart of a truly exceptional woman. Like so many other royal brides, Leonor was sent to England at a young age, promised to the future Edward I when she was only 12 years old. But this Spanish infanta quickly adapted to her new home, earning admiration for her grace, erudition, and charity. Somewhat unusual at that time, Edward and Leonor seemed to enjoy a genuinely loving and respectful marriage. The king relied on his wife's advice, entrusting her with key diplomatic missions and even directing the government when he was away on military campaigns. In fact, Leonor spent much of her marriage traveling, accompanying Edward on his endless wars and royal progresses. This was no small thing in an era when traveling was slow, arduous, and full of dangers, especially for a woman almost constantly pregnant. But Evelina took to the road with fortitude, overseeing a huge domestic staff and earning a reputation for her tireless work ethic. Somewhat unusual for a queen, she even accompanied Edward on the crusade to the Holy Land in 1270, sharing the hardships of that campaign. However, it was in times of crisis when Evelina truly shone. When Edward was wounded with a poisoned dagger in the Holy Land, she sucked the poison from his arm, risking her life to save him. And when her first child died in infancy, Evelina was a great comfort to the grieving Edward. But perhaps Evelina's defining moment came in 1290, when she and Edward traveled north to quell a Scottish rebellion. After months of hard travel, the 49-year-old queen fell seriously ill with fever, probably due to the harsh conditions. As she lay dying in a town near Lincoln, Evelina gathered her strength to dictate her will and say goodbye to her grieving husband. Devastated by her loss, Edward ordered an elaborate funeral procession to take her body back to London, erecting the famous Eleanor crosses at each stop. Today, those elegant stone crosses still stand as a testament to a truly remarkable medieval queen, a woman who combined piety, intelligence, and an indomitable spirit to leave a lasting mark on the history of England. Through the stories of women like Margarita of Provence and Leonor of Castile, we can glimpse the complex reality of the lives of royal women in the Middle Ages. They were not delicate parlor flowers, but strong, intelligent, and resilient figures who navigated the treacherous currents of medieval politics with skill and determination. However, even as we admire their strength, we must remember the high price they paid for their elevated position. In a world where royal women were valued primarily as marriage objects and reproducers, even the most privileged faced a life of uncertainty, danger, and loss. From the ever-present threat of childbirth to the constant struggle for power and influence, the life of a medieval queen was like walking a tightrope over an abyss. One misstep, a premature death, or a change in fortune could cause even the most carefully constructed life to plunge into chaos. And yet, despite all the dangers they faced, these royal women found a way to forge their own destiny and leave their mark on history. Whether as patrons of the arts, skilled political operators, or simply unwavering companions to their royal husbands, queens like Margarita and Evelina carved out spheres of influence that extended beyond the confines of their castle walls. In the end, perhaps that is the most lasting lesson we can draw from the lives of medieval royal women. That even in the face of unimaginable adversity, the human spirit has an incredible capacity for resilience, ingenuity, and elegance. These were women who carried the weight of crowns and kingdoms on their shoulders and did so with strength and dignity that resonates through the centuries. So, the next time you find yourself wandering through the drafty halls of a medieval castle or admiring the effigy of a long-dead queen, take a moment to remember the extraordinary women who once brought those stone walls to life. Theirs was a world of unimaginable grandeur and danger, of dizzying triumphs and crushing defeats. But despite everything, they resisted. And in doing so, they left us a legacy of courage, resilience, and indomitable spirit that still has the power to inspire us today. As the story of Margarita of Provence illustrates, even the grandest royal pilgrimages could take a distressing turn. The dangers of travel in medieval times were numerous. from treacherous roads to the risk of ambushes, diseases, and shipwrecks. However, for royal women, the pilgrimage was not only an act of piety. It was a rare opportunity to live adventures beyond the limits of the castle walls. Isabel of Francia, wife of King Edward II, embarked on a different journey, one that would take her down a dark and tortuous path. Born into the bosom of the French royal family, Isabel was famous for her beauty and intelligence. In 1308, at only 12 years, she married Edward in a great ceremony destined to seal the alliance between England and France. But her marriage was problematic from the start. Edward was a weak and frivolous king, more interested in luxurious entertainments and the company of his favorites than in the affairs of state. He showered his friend Piers Gaveston with titles and riches, which aroused the envy of his barons. Isabel, for her part, found herself increasingly marginalized and humiliated at court. As tensions increased, Isabel waited for the opportune moment and plotted her revenge. In 1325, she convinced Edward to allow her to travel to France, ostensibly to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother, King Charles IV. But once she crossed the Channel, Isabel revealed her true intentions. She began to gather supporters and openly took Roger Mortimer, a powerful English noble, as her lover. Together, Isabel and Mortimer raised an army and invaded England, determined to dethrone Edward and govern in his place. The king fled from London, but was soon captured. In an unexpected turn, Edward was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, where, according to legend, he met a terrifying end. They stuck a red-hot poker into his entrails. With Edward out of the way, Isabel and Mortimer governed England for several years. The she-wolf of France, as Isabel came to be known, had overthrown a king and installed her teenage son, Edward III, as a puppet monarch. It was an impressive turn of fate and proof of Isabel's determination and political acumen. But power is a capricious mistress, and Isabel's control over the reins of the state would not last forever. Upon reaching the age of majority, Edward III began to resent his mother's authoritarian methods and Mortimer's arrogance. In 1330, the young king staged a coup, arrested Mortimer, and executed him for treason. Isabel was spared but stripped of her lands and riches, and she was sent to live the rest of her days in comfortable exile. Isabel's story is a stark reminder that even the most influential queens of the Middle Ages were ultimately dependent on the whims of men, whether husbands, sons, or lovers. The same wit and cunning that could elevate a woman to dizzying heights of power could easily be her undoing. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, the lives of royal women began to change in subtle but significant ways. The Renaissance brought new ideas about education and the arts, and noble ladies increasingly dedicated themselves to learning for the simple sake of learning. Queens like Isabel I of England and Isabel I of Castile would exercise power in their own right, reshaping the political landscape of Europe. However, even as the old feudal order crumbled, the medieval ideals of femininity and royalty cast a long shadow. Royal women continued to be valued for their beauty, their fertility, and above all, their piety. They had to navigate a treacherous world in which power was precarious and danger lurked around every corner. From Matilda's tenacious struggle for the English crown to Isabel's ruthless revenge, the stories of the medieval queens are full of drama, intrigue, and surprising resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. These women were more than pretty faces or political pawns. They were mothers, warriors, scholars, and leaders in their own right. And so we come to the end of our journey through the turbulent lives of royal women in the Middle Ages. In drafty halls and sumptuous chambers, on wind-swept battlefields and arduous pilgrimages, these extraordinary women left an indelible mark on history. As we fall asleep, let us dream of their triumphs, mourn their tragedies, and marvel at the indomitable spirit that carried them through an age of iron and blood. Good night, dear listener, and sweet dreams of maidens and fierce queens. Music. As the sun began to set over the rolling English countryside, casting a warm glow on the stone walls of the castle. We return once more to our exploration of the lives of the women of royalty in the Middle Ages. The corridors of power were lonely and dangerous places even for the most privileged ladies. One of these formidable women was Isabel of Francia, who would become known as the She-Wolf of Francia for her tenacity and cunning. Born into the bosom of the French royal family in 1295, Isabel was married to King Edward II of England at the tender age of 12 as part of a diplomatic alliance. But her marriage was tumultuous from its beginning. It was rumored that Edward preferred the company of his male favorites, in particular the unpopular Piers Gaveston, to that of his young wife. Isabel, feeling scorned and isolated in a foreign court, was forced to navigate the treacherous waters of English politics virtually alone. But she did so with a skill and determination that would make her one of the most influential figures of the 14th century. As tensions increased between Edward and his barons, who resented the power and influence he had granted to Gaveston, Isabel found herself caught in the middle. It is said that she begged her husband to send Gaveston away for his own safety, but Edward refused. In 1312, the barons took matters into their own hands and executed Gaveston, to the king's great distress and rage. In the following years, Isabel bore Eduardo 4 children, among them the future King Edward III. But her marriage continued to deteriorate, worsened by the ineffective government of Edward and the growing influence of her new favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. By 1325, Isabel had already had enough. Under the pretext of negotiating a peace treaty with France, Isabel traveled to her homeland and refused to return. There she began to conspire with her lover, Roger Mortimer, and her son, Prince Edward, to dethrone her husband. In 1326, they invaded England with a small army and quickly gained support from disgruntled nobles. Faced with little resistance, Isabel and Mortimer seized power and forced Edward II to abdicate in favor of his son. The deposed king was imprisoned and later died under mysterious circumstances, leading many to speculate that he was murdered on Isabel's orders. For the next 4 years, Isabel and Mortimer ruled England as regents for young Edward III. It was a remarkable change of fortune for a woman who had begun her life as a political pawn. Thanks to her intelligence, perseverance, and audacity, Isabel had become one of the most powerful figures in England, subverting the traditional gender roles of her time. Her story reminds us that, even in the male-dominated world of medieval politics, there were women who found ways to exert their influence and shape the course of history. But Isabel's power would not last. When Edward III came of age, he began to resent the control that Mortimer exerted over his government. In 1330, the young king staged a coup, had Mortimer arrested, and then executed. Isabel, although spared her lover's fate, was effectively removed from power and spent the rest of her life in comfortable retirement. As night falls on the tranquil English landscape, we remember the many royal women, like Isabel, who navigated the complex and often treacherous world of medieval politics. Their stories are of resilience, courage, and a relentless struggle for autonomy in a society that often denied it. In our next story, we will meet another extraordinary woman whose piety and patronage would leave an indelible mark on the cultural landscape of medieval England. Philippa of Hainaut, wife of Edward III, may not have wielded a sword or led armies into battle, but her influence would be felt in the realms of art, literature, and religion for generations. As we prepare to explore Philippa's story, let us take a moment to reflect on the lives of these royal women, the challenges they faced, the triumphs they achieved, and the legacies they left behind. In a world that often opposed them, their determination and strength continue to inspire us today. But for now, let us rest and let the gentle embrace of sleep transport us to a bygone era, where the stone walls of castles stood against the horizon and the echoes of history whispered through centuries. Good night and sweet dreams. When reflecting on the precarious situation, the political intrigues, and the lack of autonomy that marked the lives of royal women in the Middle Ages, it is worth taking a closer look at some of the strong-willed queens who managed to carve out real spheres of influence despite the adversities they faced. One of the most notable examples is Isabel of France, whose story is as dramatic and tumultuous as the plot of any soap opera. Born into the French royal family in 1295, Isabel was married to King Edward II of England at the tender age of 12 as part of a diplomatic alliance. But her marriage was far from a fairy tale. Edward was known for his favorites, among whom was the unpopular Hugh Despenser the Younger. As tensions increased, Isabel found herself increasingly marginalized and mistreated by her husband and his inner circle. But instead of resigning herself to a life of misery, this fighting French princess decided to take the reins of her own destiny. In 1325, Isabel traveled to France under the pretext of a diplomatic mission. But it soon became clear that she had other plans. Joining forces with her lover, the exiled English Baron Roger Mortimer, Isabel gathered an army and launched an invasion of England to dethrone her husband. We're talking about a woman scorned. Her campaign proved a resounding success. Edward II was forced to abdicate in favor of his young son, Edward III, with Isabel and Mortimer as regents. For a few years, this formidable couple held power in England. It was a remarkable turn of fate for a woman who had once been nothing more than a pawn in the political intrigues of men. But power is capricious, and Isabel's glory days did not last. When Edward III came of age, he began to resent the influence of his mother and her lover. In 1330, he staged a coup, arrested Mortimer, and executed him for treason. Isabel was spared, but forced to retire to a quiet life, spending the rest of her days in relative anonymity. Although Isabel's story is undoubtedly one of the most dramatic examples, she was not the only medieval queen who wielded real political power. In fact, in times of war or crusades, when kings were often absent for long periods, it was not uncommon for queens to take over and rule in their place as regents. One of them was Blanca of Castile, who served as regent of France on 2 occasions during the 13th century. A Spanish princess by birth, Blanca married King Louis VI of France at the age of 12. When Louis died just 12 years later, Blanca found herself in the difficult position of ruling on behalf of her young son, Louis IX. Despite facing opposition from rebellious barons who resented being ruled by a woman, Blanca proved to be a capable and effective ruler. She suppressed uprisings, negotiated treaties, and even personally led troops in battle when necessary. Under her direction, France enjoyed relative stability and a period of prosperity. Blanca would return to take command when her son embarked on the Seventh Crusade in 1248. For 6 years, she governed France as regent, guiding the country through the challenges of her son's absence. When Louis IX returned in 1254, Blanca had cemented her reputation as one of the most powerful and influential women of her time. Of course, not all medieval queens were able to translate their prominent positions into real political power. Many were limited by gender roles and expectations that restricted the lives of women throughout society. For example, Isabel Woodville, wife of King Edward IV of England, suffered negative reactions for the influence attributed to her over her husband. As a commoner who had married royalty, Isabel was hated by the old nobility, who saw the rise of her family as a threat to their own power. Despite the fact that Eduardo clearly depended on Isabel as a trusted advisor and confidant, she was portrayed as an ambitious, greedy woman who had overreached. After the death of Eduardo, Isabel's enemies were quick to turn against her, imprison her, and execute her brother and her children under false accusations of treason. Thus, although some medieval queens managed to defy adversities and carve out real spheres of influence, they had to tread carefully in a world deeply suspicious of female power. The precariousness of their positions meant that even the most capable women could be quickly dethroned. It is a harsh reality that highlights the challenges faced by royal women in the Middle Ages. Theirs was a world of constant uncertainty in which even the fate of ladies of the highest birth could change in the blink of an eye. And yet, in the face of such adversity, many managed to leave their mark on history, paving the way for a slow but steady march toward greater gender equality in the centuries to come. As we conclude our exploration of the lives of medieval queens, it is worth taking a moment to reflect on the incredible resilience and strength that these women demonstrated in the face of unimaginable difficulty. From political pawns to powerful regents, their stories are a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, even in dark times. So, the next time you find yourself wandering through an old, drafty castle or admiring a centuries-old tapestry, take a moment to remember the incredible women who once walked those same halls and whose legacy continues to inspire us to this day. Because, although the world of medieval royalty may seem incredibly distant from ours, the courage and determination of these extraordinary queens is something that continues to resonate through the centuries. As the story of Queen Philippa of Hainault illustrates, the women of medieval royalty who assumed the role of pious patrons and intercessors could wield a form of soft power and leave a lasting cultural legacy. But others sought a more direct path to political influence, crossing the traditional sphere of royalty to pursue their ambitions, for better or worse. One of the most dramatic examples of a queen who claimed power is the story of Isabel of France. Born in 1295, Isabel was the daughter of King Philippe IV of France. At the age of 12, she was sent to England to marry King Edward II of 23 years. It was an agreement intended to foster peace between the kingdoms, but which sowed the seeds of future dispute. Eduardo II proved to be an inept and frivolous ruler who angered the English nobility by indulging his male favorites with undue influence and wealth. Poor Isabel not only had to deal with an irresponsible husband, but she was marginalized in court by his companions, such as Piers Gaveston. Her humiliation increased when Edward neglected his marital duties to the point that some questioned whether his firstborn was his heir. Tensions finally erupted in 1325, when Isabel, now a frustrated queen of about 30, traveled to France on a diplomatic mission. There she forged an alliance with her exiled lover Roger Mortimer to gather an invading force. In a surprising turn of events, Isabel landed on the English coast in 1326 and declared her intention to depose Edward for considering him incompetent. Surprisingly, the royal couple's teenage son, the future Edward III, sided with his mother in the coup. The hapless king was quickly defeated. He was forced to abdicate and was later brutally murdered, almost certainly on the orders of Isabel and Mortimer. For 4 years, the rebellious queen ruled as regent for her young son, taking revenge on her enemies and rewarding her supporters. It was an intoxicating period of female power that upset all notions of what a highborn woman could do. But Isabel's affair with Mortimer and her increasingly ruthless actions alienated the nobles. When Edward III came of age in 1330, he took control through a palace coup. Isabel was initially confined to house arrest, although she eventually reconciled with her son and lived to an advanced age. The story of Isabel of France reminds us of how much was at stake in the game of medieval politics in which royal women were involved. Her daring actions distinguish her from many contemporaries who were manipulated as passive pawns. She took her destiny into her own hands in the most dramatic way imaginable. However, Isabel's rise and fall also illustrate the fine line that medieval queens had to walk. Taking too much power openly could provoke a violent reaction, as there was an underlying unease with female autonomy. A queen was meant to influence, not rule openly. The most skilled found ways to exercise power within the limits of their functions. As we have seen, whether taking drastic measures like Isabel or seeking more subtle ways to influence change, the women of medieval royalty were never mere decorative consorts. They were political actors in their own right, constantly navigating a treacherous world of shifting alliances, intrigue, and danger. It was a harsh existence in many ways, but one that gave rise to some truly remarkable characters. So, next time you visit a great medieval castle or admire the beauty of an illuminated manuscript, spare a thought for the royal women who were behind it all. It may be that they are often relegated to footnotes in history books, but their stories deserve to be told because it is their silent struggles and resistance to overwhelming adversities that, in many ways, give texture to the complex tapestry of the medieval world. And with this, we conclude our stories about these formidable royal women. If you enjoyed returning to the halls of medieval power, don't forget to click like and subscribe to our channel. There are many more fascinating historical corners to explore together. But for now, let the hypnotic sound of the spinning wheel gently lull you asleep. Perhaps you will dream of beautiful maidens and very tall castle towers. Sweet dreams, dear viewers. Until next time, goodbye.